Did you know that between 1895 and 1937, 93 men were executed behind the walls of Folsom Prison? But their stories, they weren't lost to time. They just needed a voice. Welcome to Falling Through the Trap, where we dive into the deep, often unsettling waters of historical true crime, as well as our criminal justice system, both past and present. I'm April Moore, author and criminal justice professional, and I invite you on a journey through the human stories buried in prison records, newspaper headlines, courtroom transcripts, and so much more. I'm not just recounting cases. I'm probing into justice's paradoxes and presenting humanity found in a place we're told there isn't any: prison. Through the stories of these 93 men, we'll look at history, ethics, and certainly the death penalty, and whether or not it should have a place in America's present and future. Hello, welcome to the next episode. As you probably know, this podcasting thing is new to me, and one thing I've learned is how much time it requires to put together 2 episodes a month. And while brevity isn't my strong suit either, that means I'm going to scale back to 1 episode a month, the third Friday of each month. But that will free up some time for me to finally work on all of the extras for the Patreon account. And there will be some free stuff in there too. I'm really looking forward to getting all that pulled together for you because there's a lot of fascinating things to share, like photos, articles, and some bonus episodes. I really appreciate everyone's support so far. I hope you're all enjoying the episodes, and I'm always curious about your take on the stories, so let me know. Today, I'm tackling 5 stories, and while that may seem like a lot, given how long the previous episodes have been, these are on the smaller side. Their executions also occurred consecutively, all within 14 months, so there's some intertwining, even with the men from the previous 3 stories. Not that you have to remember or know anything from those episodes to hear this one. It just simply made sense to combine these. So with that, let's get on with the show. Our episode begins with Paulo Kamaunu, executed June 19, 1896. While 27-year-old Kamaunu, a native of Hawaii, was Folsom's 4th execution, he was the very first one to occupy the prison's condemned row. His journey there started on May 6, 1894. Ellen Robinson, a widow, around the age of 65 to 70, lived in Latrobe, California, in El Dorado County, about 35 miles east of Sacramento. Her husband Charles had passed 14 years earlier. Latrobe, at the time, was the terminus of the Placerville and Sacramento railroads, with a population around 700 to 800. Ellen kept a small cottage on 200 acres that she and Charles had owned, where she now raised a few cattle, chickens, turkeys, and grew produce that she sold locally. She lived a modest and quiet little existence. Sometime between 9 and 11 p.m. on May 6th, she answered a knock on her door. She recognized the tall, powerfully built man, the Kanaka, who had purchased a chicken from her earlier that day. The term Kanaka was used then to describe those from Hawaii or anyone from the South Pacific. She told her accountant, a Mr. Barrett, who had stopped by that evening to discuss business, that she didn't like the look of the man. And she noted that after he bought the chicken from her, he had left in the direction of the camp where he and another Hawaiian worked as woodchoppers. The press would later describe him as a, quote, handsome specimen of physical manhood. But that night, Ellen saw his very ugly side. That evening, her neighbor, Mr. McCarty, believed he heard muffled screams, but a dog, later proved to be Ellen's, kept barking in a field, making it difficult for McCarty to know for sure what he had heard. In any case, he ignored it and went to bed, but the dog continued barking throughout the night. Early the following morning, another neighbor, on his way to work at the railroad station, stumbled across a bloody revolver outside Ellen's front gate. Peeking over the fence, he made the gruesome discovery. The bruised and broken body of Ellen Robinson lay crumpled on the porch. Nearly every rib was crushed or fractured, and her blackened and bloodied face bore the imprint of the murder weapon, an ironclad boot heel. Police believe the killer had hit her over the head with the butt of the revolver before stomping her to death. The inside of the house lay in shambles as trunks and drawers had been dumped out, furniture scattered. Burned matches found on the floor confirmed the murder and burglary occurred well after dark. El Dorado County Sheriff George H. Hilbert and District Attorney Prentice Carpenter arrived, and Mr. Barrett supplied them with a description of a potential suspect, the woodchopper. The men went to the train station, assuming that the killer or killers would likely try to catch the first passenger train to Sacramento that evening, and two, quote, suspicious characters, one giving the name of Napoleon and the other as Leloy, both Hawaiians, had attempted to board the train. They said they had completed their woodchopping contract the night before and were heading to Sacramento. Each denied having anything to do with the murder or even buying a chicken from the woman. Hilbert noticed some scratches on the upper body of Napoleon and insisted the men bring them to where they had set up camp, which revealed chicken entrails and feathers, and according to one report, a pair of old boot heels were found under a heavy rock in a nearby creek. Indeed, Napoleon, who was later identified as Paulo Kamaunu, was wearing old boots that had been fitted with a new set of ironclad heels. While he continued to deny involvement, his partner, Leloy, told authorities Kamaunu had purchased the chicken from Ms. Robinson and upon his return expressed his belief that the elderly woman would have plenty of money and valuables for the taking because she had readily made change for him. Leloy refused to participate, and after the pair drank heavily that night, Leloy fell asleep, but Kamaunu slinked off to her house and rolled back in about 11 or 12, telling Leloy that he killed the old woman, but that to his surprise and disappointment, he found nothing of value in her home. Apparently, he only regretted leaving behind his revolver, a rusted British Bulldog 5-shooter. The press said that Kamaunu confessed. To whom and to what extent, I don't know, but both men were charged. In mid-August, while awaiting his September trial, Kamaunu wrote a letter to a Mrs. Isbell, a Salvationist who had reportedly taken interest in his case. Under the headline, "The Wage of Sin," the Sacramento Daily Union printed the long letter where Kamaunu bemoaned his position, begged forgiveness, and called himself a, quote, poor, unfortunate creature in distress who committed the crime while under the influence of liquor. Laced with regret, the letter was written in the vein of a philosophizing poet, lamenting a world full of misery and shame. He wrote, "Malice and envy, and jealousy and covetousness make neighborhoods unpleasant, divide families, and break hearts. Oh, could my sins be buried out of sight and forgiven? They say, oh, that I might go where the sad and shameful story would never be known, but they cannot forget it. The remembrance of it haunts them relentlessly. It bites like a serpent and stings like an adder. He credited a man named Thomas Carr with urging him to confess, an act he felt confident would spare him the noose. He wrote, "My experience has been such that I cannot trust in anything I do. I long to be saved from myself. The burden of my cry is, who shall deliver me? It is in the weariness, the loathing of self, which makes myself intolerable. I want to be set free from it, to be made entirely clean, to have a new clean spirit put within me." He closed the letter with, "I will pray to God to help me. So goodbye, kind lady, and don't forget to pray for me." Now, records for this case were few and far between, but we know that at his trial a month later, the judge ruled that that particular confession was not altogether voluntary and therefore inadmissible. During the trial, the charges against Leloy were dropped, and he testified against Kamaunu. Evidently, the prosecution was able to prove that after Kamaunu confessed to Leloy right after the murder, he threatened to kill him if Leloy ratted him out. And the gun left at the scene was identified by a man who said Kamaunu had stolen it from him in the same camp. It's not clear what Kamaunu's defense even was aside from intoxication. I'm also not sure where the boot heels found in the creek figure into the story. He could have used them as handheld weapons, or were on his boots and he changed them out for new ones after the murder. In any case, the jury determined after 3 hours of deliberation that Paulo Kamaunu should hang. His court-appointed attorneys, Charles Swissler and Abe Darlington, filed an appeal. But unlike those who hanged before him, who were permitted to wait out the appeal decision in the county or city jail, Kamaunu was taken to Folsom right away on September 25, 1894. A couple of months later, a man named Salter D. Warden would join him on death row, found guilty of train wrecking, which, as I mentioned in the last episode, was a capital offense in California for a short bit. His sentence would be commuted 4 years later in 1898, after witnessing, so to speak, 11 hangings. So for a year, it was just him and Kamaunu. Then Chin Hain, Folsom's first execution, arrived in October of 1895, then Ivan Kovalev in November. Kamaunu's appeal decision from the California Supreme Court took about a year and a half, a little longer than usual, and the press labeled it tardy justice. And the same press that called him handsome took to now calling him repulsive looking. So they were happy when the appeal denial was issued in February of 1896, just before Kovalev's execution. Kamaunu was sentenced to hang April 10th. One paper wrote, "He received his sentence without a quiver, and with the stolidity of one void of every vestige of humanity." But then, a further delay, asked for by the Hawaiian government, and they wanted the skinny on what happened because for 6 years, Kamaunu had worked for the late king, Kalakaua, and his successor, the former queen, Kapiolani. Kamaunu had evidently sent a letter to the queen asking for help. Governor Budd issued a reprieve to Kamaunu, who was the first of the 93 to get a reprieve post-appeal, which actually wasn't very common once the appeal was denied. I don't think the next one was issued until about 1915. Then they were issued quite a bit, starting in the early 1930s. Anyway, a representative from the Hawaiian government arrived at the end of May and met with Governor Budd and District Attorney Prentice Carpenter, who gave them both the rundown of the crime and the evidence. And Budd didn't see any reason to issue a commutation. A decision fully accepted by the Hawaiian government. Paulo Kamaunu's execution date of June 19th would stand. The spring of 1896 proved busy for Folsom's death row. On April 14th, John Craig arrived at the prison. The same day, George W. Roberts, its sixth execution, committed his crime, also in Latrobe, where Ellen Robinson lived. On May 5th, John Howard, the fifth execution, arrived. On June 19th, 1 week after hearing the clamor of the gallows for the third time as John Craig plunged through the trap, Kamaunu took his turn on the scaffold. He spent the night before writing letters to family, and he accepted Catholicism from Father Hunt, prison chaplain. His last request was to have his Bible and rosary buried with him, and another Bible and dictionary be sent to his niece in Hawaii. That morning, he continued to deny responsibility for the murder and reportedly walked to his death calmly. As usual, it was also reported that he thanked Warden Charles All for the, quote, kind treatment, although the San Francisco Examiner wrote that Kamaunu never gave prison staff trouble, earning him, quote, more than ordinary consideration. Regardless, reporters knew to stay on All's good side if they wanted future access to prisoners and the death chamber. One witness, a 73-year-old male neighbor of Miss Robinson's, fainted when the trap sprung, not an unusual occurrence, and it was reported that of the 4 executions thus far at the prison, Kamaunu's was the fastest, 12 minutes from the moment he left his cell to the time his heart stopped. Here's what I could find on Ellen Robinson. She was Irish, and she married Charles, a Swede, in 1862 in El Dorado County. They were both in their 30s, and at the age of 57, Charles died of tongue cancer in May of 1880, 14 years before Ellen was killed. She had no children or other family other than a cousin in El Dorado County and 2 in San Francisco. Between the 200 acres and her belongings, her estate was valued at $2,000, about $75,000 today. It was in probate for 7 years and eventually was divided among the 3 cousins. 4 days after Kamaunu's execution, George W. Roberts, Folsom's 6th execution and Kamaunu's fellow Latrobe resident, entered the prison and took his place on death row. But the story of John E. Howard, the man who would mount the gallows a month after Kamaunu's burial in the prison cemetery, comes next. John E. Howard, Folsom's 5th execution, July 17th, 1896. In Tulare, California, in the San Joaquin Valley, nearly 6 weeks after Kamaunu killed Ellen Robinson, Deputy Marshal John E. Howard secured his fate on the Folsom gallows. It began around 2:30 in the afternoon of June 16, 1894, when 36-year-old Howard, assigned to weed out the undesirable elements, the prostitutes, drug users, and drunks, much like what John Craig from the last episode was doing, came to Susanna Delgardo's home to look for Martino Dell'Anina, a 20-year-old Italian. He had shoved Susanna, his prostitute girlfriend, 2 weeks earlier, but she chose not to press charges and the two reconciled. This was the second time in 2 days that John Howard had come to the house looking for Martino. Susanna and another man, Attilio Del Valle, sat on the porch as Howard pushed his coat back, showing his deputy marshal badge, saying that this time he had a warrant for her boyfriend. He asked her if she had any wine to give him, and when she said no, he told her he had every right to run her and Martino out of town. Susanna could never stand Howard. Not many people could. and she knew he was bluffing. That's how Howard worked. He was a bully who liked to intimidate and throw around threats, but he lacked the gumption when it came to follow through. Plus, he preferred to use people to his advantage. Susanna knew that, like many times before, Howard only wanted Martino to act as an informant. When Martino approached the house, he told Howard to go ahead and arrest him. But Howard said, "I'm going to take you in next time." As the men turned to go to the Europa Hotel, Susanna heard Howard say to Martino, "If you help me, I'll help you." At the hotel where Martino roomed, the men drank wine with Baptiste Ribot, one of the hotel's owners. Then Howard went to what was referred to as the Negro House to, quote, visit the girls, and Martino stayed in the hotel's dining room. 10 minutes later, Howard returned with an empty half-gallon jug and asked Ribot to fill it with wine, which he did. Then Howard left. Hours later, around 7:30 p.m., Howard returned. He told Martino to join him in the backyard of the hotel. Martino obliged, but came back within minutes, telling Baptiste Ribot, Frank Graffino, the hotel's other owner, and Attilio Del Valle that Howard, quote, wants some money, but I can't give him any, for I have not enough for myself. Howard then came in and joined the men for another drink and told Ribot to refill the jug, but he refused. To this, Howard replied, "If you don't give me some wine, I'll arrest the whole house." Ribot ignored the empty threat. Then Howard told Martino to follow him back out again to talk. Out back, the men stood about 4 feet apart and had been talking for about 5 minutes, piquing the interest of Ribot's 14-year-old son, Vincencio, who stood in a doorway. His 9-year-old sister, Mary, sat in a bed next to a window that faced the backyard. They both heard Martino say to Howard, "You can't make me shut my mouth," before turning around to go back inside, and as he did so, Howard mumbled, "You can't make me shut mine." Howard took out 2 pistols and said, "Take that, you son of a bitch," before he fired at Martino, the bullet striking him in the back of the head. Mary, Vincencio, and Ribot all saw Martino fall and Howard immediately flee. Del Valle then retrieved Constable Pat Conway, and they eventually intercepted Howard, and they met up with Constable P.H. Murray, who happened to be with a Visalia Times-Delta reporter, and they all proceeded to the hotel to investigate the scene. Several people crowded around the body. Conway knew Howard's self-defense claim didn't hold water. The Times reporter offered his interesting observation, writing, "The dead man was lying in the rear of Graffino's lodging house, and the expression on his face did not indicate that he had been angry." I think the stronger evidence against the self-defense claim was that he was shot in the back of the head. Martino's dog lay next to him, resting its head on his dead owner's legs. When Susanna arrived, she, quote, cried and tore her hair, and Del Valle, who had reportedly known Martino since birth, wiped the blood from his friend's face. Constable Murray determined that while Howard was not drunk, he was under the influence. Howard told Murray, "He tried to run me in and I wouldn't have it." Howard carried an air of confidence that he would be released soon enough, but in the meantime, strongly objected to being housed in the jail and had but one favor to ask: to not be put, quote, in that nasty Chinese stink pot. Murray ignored him. The reporter wrote, "The thought of a night in the calaboose so horrified the gentle murderer and so lacerated his sensitive nerve that he refused to talk." After the coroner's jury found Howard guilty, the preliminary hearing took place June 19th, 3 days after the murder, where District Attorney W.H. Alford pointed out what he called the irony of fate, as Martino Dillanina's body was being removed from the next room for burial, just as proceedings got underway. The court appointed W.W. Middlecoff and H.C. Lilly to represent Howard, but the defense didn't offer any testimony. And in mid-July, Howard pleaded not guilty. 9 days later, in Los Angeles, John Craig, also a former officer with a very similar reputation, murdered his wife and in-laws using 2 guns and claiming self-defense as well. Sounds like these two would have gotten along very well. Howard's trial, presided over by Judge Wheaton Gray, began on August 6, 1894, with a long list of witnesses, most of whom requiring Italian interpreters, who were witnesses themselves. Many people testified to hearing the gunshot, the simultaneous pistol flash, and Martino falling to the ground. They also confirmed that the victim didn't have a weapon, contrary to what Howard claimed. Even Frank Graffino, co-owner of the hotel, kept Martino's pistol, a condition tenants had to abide by. Peter Spears, a black shoe shiner, testified that after the shooting, Howard came up to him saying that he had, quote, killed that son of a bitch of a Dago, a derogatory slur aimed at Italians and Greeks, and I want you to go and tell those girls to bury that gun and go quick. Howard was referring to the black women in the house he routinely visited. Another man testified that Howard encountered him and 2 others on the street after the shooting, admitting he, quote, got that fellow, that Dago son of a bitch behind the Italian hotel. One man said Howard offered him $500 to say that Howard and Martino were playing cards, and that Martino drew a knife and that he had to shoot the man in self-defense. The defense opened with W.J. Carlisle, the city marshal, who hired Howard to dig up evidence against brothels and, quote, clear the town of these kinds of people. Carlisle claimed that Martino complained to him about Howard making trouble with him and his woman, and that he would do him up. He called Martino quarrelsome and a bully among his people. A man named Edward Ellis testified that the day before the killing, Martino told him that when he found Howard, he'd cut a hole in him big enough to crawl into, and that he had a gun. William Sayers, a friend of Ellis's, claimed he had been walking past the hotel at the time as 2 men talked, and that he saw one man raise his hand with something bright in it and lunged toward the other man, who jumped aside. Then he heard a shot, and the men staggered out of his line of sight. This account contrasted the testimony of Vincencio and Mary Rebo, the siblings, as well as others, who witnessed the murder, and considering Martino sustained a bullet wound to the back of the head, it made Sayers' account all the more unlikely. And again, no weapon was found near or on Martino by any witness or investigator. Howard then took the stand and denied talking to Susanna, Attilio, Del Valle, or Martino at the home, and claimed he only saw the victim around 7:45 that evening outside the hotel when he allegedly called to Howard and said, "You son of a bitch, you want my woman to have me arrested," and then drew a knife with which he tried to strike Howard. He said, "I drew a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson and shot him." He denied making the $500 bribe or saying anything to Peter Spears about burying the gun. His entire testimony ran counter to the handfuls of witnesses who all told the same story. In rebuttal, the prosecution called Constables Murray and Conway and several others, who swore Martino actually had a good reputation and rarely caused trouble. After 4 days of testimony, the case went to the jury, who returned 3 hours later with a guilty verdict. A local paper read, "There can be no question but that the jury believed that the evidence for the defense was patched up and manufactured." Interestingly, The jury took 10 ballots, with the first being 11 for guilty and 1 for innocent. It wasn't until the third ballot that all agreed on guilt. The degree of guilt, however, took several more ballots, as the jurymen couldn't agree on first degree, second degree, or manslaughter. After a ninth ballot of 11 for death and 1 for life, all jurors agreed on death in the 10th ballot. Howard took the verdict calmly, but reportedly was shocked, expecting to be acquitted. He muttered, "These sons of bitches will not have the pleasure of seeing me hung or taken to San Quentin." In a way, quite true. His final resting place would be Folsom Prison, where during this time hadn't even housed its first death row inmate yet. Paulo Kamaunu wouldn't arrive for another 7 weeks. The verdict of the jury in the Howard case, read one local paper, seems to meet the universal approval of among the people of Visalia. The doomed man is guilty, and the 12 men who had the courage to fix the death penalty deserve the thanks of the community. The Tulare Advance Register wrote, "The prospect of hanging does not make Howard docile, and deputies have had to put an organ boot on John Howard over at the county jail, so that in case he should fall out of the window at any time, the boot would likely catch between the bars and hold him until the sun should get high in the heavens and the disaster be discovered." Due to numerous threats to escape, Howard wore the Oregon boot for 9 of his 20 months of confinement in the county jail. If you're not familiar, the Oregon boot, also called the Gardner shackle, was invented in 1866 by J.C. Gardner, warden of Oregon State Penitentiary at the time. He wanted something to prevent escapes that was better than a ball and chain. It was basically a steel cylinder weighing 15 to 25 pounds that fit around the shin and calf. Definitely not a boot for walking. And it was said that Gardner was inspired by a similar device used on slaves. He ended up patenting the design, and it was used in prisons all over. And while similar boots were made, each trying to avoid patent infringement, they were all eventually referred to as the Oregon boot. As Howard remained in jail, awaiting the outcome of his appeal, proof of the defense's suspected patched up and manufactured evidence surfaced when Edward Ellis and William Sayers were arrested for perjuring themselves in the case, a charge they pleaded guilty to. This didn't help Howard's case, and by June of 1895, with his appeal still not decided upon, a newspaper reported that Grove L. Johnson joined his legal team to argue his case when it came up before the state Supreme Court in November of 1895. Now, Grove L. Johnson had been an attorney since the 1860s, but by this time had served in both state houses of California's legislature and was a U.S. congressman. Oddly, from 1895 to 1897, he was serving in the U.S. House of Representatives, so I'm not sure when he found the time to work on Howard's case, let alone how he was even retained to defend him. But his name was never brought up again, so I'm not sure. I would be remiss if I didn't mention, though, that Grove was the father of Hiram W. Johnson, who was also a California attorney who will pop up in later stories, both as an attorney and as governor of California, before going on to the U.S. Senate for 28 years. Anyhow, in March of 1896, the California Supreme Court unanimously upheld the verdict, saying that for Howard to have established a self-defense claim, he needed to show that he believed his life to be in imminent danger, something the evidence definitely failed to show. Judge Gray sentenced Howard to hang at Folsom on July 17th, and on May 5th joined Kamaunu, John Craig, and our train wrecker, Salter Warden, on death row, the first 2 being hanged the following month. On July 16th, the night before his execution, Howard apparently joked with one of his death watch guards, asking, "Are you a good hand putting up a job? I would like to put up a job to fool the warden by having another man substituted in my place on the gallows." That night, he also told a reporter from the San Francisco Examiner, "I have no statement to make. If I did, no one would believe me." But he said that his employer, W.J. Carlyle, knew all the facts. "Be sure and see him," he said. "The trouble I'm in grew out of a primary election. Carlyle will tell you all about it. What can I say, except that I'm innocent? I have a good record." The paper, however, also wrote, "The warden has been told by prominent citizens of Tulare that the murder was not Howard's first crime, that he killed a man some time ago in Yolo County." I wasn't able to find any information to verify this. The San Francisco Call wrote that when Howard first arrived at Folsom, he expressed sorrow for the killing and requested religious consolation. But after Governor James Budd declined to commute his sentence, he became defiant. "Last night and this morning," wrote the paper, "he manifested indifference to the presence of a prison chaplain and dropped all pretense of religious conviction." Warden All said Howard, quote, "assumed the air of a hoodlum in carrying on as he did." In the morning, Howard ate very little of the chicken breakfast brought to him, saying he didn't, quote, intend to surprise his stomach. He dressed himself carefully and listened as Warden Charles All read the death warrant. He refused any religious consolation, then thanked the prison chaplain when he came to see him, but asked him to leave, saying he feared the kind words would cause him to break down and that he wanted to die like a man. Then his cousin, W.H. Pierce from Sutter County, arrived, along with a reporter from the San Francisco Examiner. Pierce had evidently been looking for evidence that might clear Howard, but much to Howard's disappointment, Pierce said he had failed. Howard had asked if Pierce planned to bury him, and when his cousin said yes, in Pleasant Grove, Howard said, "I'll be there. Just dig a hole and plant me in it. I don't want any flowers, not any preaching, not any autopsy either. You see to that, won't you?" He told Pierce not to let anyone look at his face except the folks. "I don't want people staring at me. There won't be nobody disgraced by my going. I suppose I ain't got nobody to blame for it but myself." He then told his cousin, "Say, tell the folks goodbye, won't you?" Howard was expecting his former employer, W.J. Carlyle, to visit him that morning and to give a statement to the press on his behalf, but he didn't. So Howard turned to the Examiner reporter and said, "The time is too short for me to make a full statement." He said he had been marshal for only 2 weeks before the shooting, and that his duty was to clear Tulare of what he called maquereau, a French word. You wouldn't have guessed that by my pronunciation. So can I pause here real quick? Maybe you all are smarter than me, but I didn't know what exactly Howard meant. So I did some digging and came upon a fabulous explanation on historicalvagabond.com. Maquereau, spelled Maquereau, the Examiner reporter added an X on the end, is the French word for mackerel, the fish, which is derived from Old English mackerel with a Q, that is said to have come from a similar Dutch word for peddler or a broker, but also from the Latin word macula, meaning spot or mark, which some species of mackerel have. By the 16th century or so, the French word for mackerel became maquereau, a slang term for pimp, one who peddles sex. And little did I know that mackerel are a flashy fish. Pimps and prostitutes are known to be flashy themselves. Slang is just another result of human ingenuity that fascinates me, and I think most of us, especially those like myself who grew up in the 80s and 90s, will get this. The term Mac, as in Mac Daddy, derives from this French word. Historical Vagabond explains that this word would have been exposed to Africans during the slave trade, thus into American black culture, specifically the Black American pimp, the Mac. Okay, so enough with that. There's a link in the show notes to Historical Vagabond that I highly recommend for a more in-depth explanation. So back to Howard. He was assigned to clear out the brothels, and he had arrested 3 to 4 of these folks. But Martino was not arrested because he had given information to Carlisle against one of these Macs. On the night of the murder, Howard said he was followed by 3 or 4 men, and later Martino called to him, as he said at trial, confronted him about trying to have him and his wife arrested. He told Martino, yes, it's true, and Martino drew a knife. In self-defense, I shot him, he said. Any man would have done the same thing. Previous reports had said that he shot Martino over wine, but he said that wasn't true. I do not drink shoestring wine. Howard loved his slang. I never did. I have whiskey, however, and had good times. He told the reporter that he thought he would be acquitted. Otherwise, he would have recruited his cousin, Mr. Pierce, earlier to help him out. He did not know that I was in trouble until after I was sentenced to death. Since then, he has done everything he could to save me, and I'm as much obliged to him as if he had. Pierce was reportedly quite upset over the situation, but Howard wasn't, and Howard asked him not to witness the hanging, so he didn't. When it came time to start the death march, he said goodbye to Salter D. Worden and arrived on the gallows. He asked to inspect the noose, but was denied. He kicked aside the strap for the ankles that was lying on top of the trap, then took his place. Called a physical wreck, weighing only 110 pounds, Howard stood on the gallows and looked at the crowd of 22 men and said, "Wardenall, I thank you for your kind attention to me during my stay here. The hide goes with the tallow. Gentlemen, let her go." 13 minutes after he fell through the trap, he was declared dead. Not long after, Deputy Harrelson in Tulare received a piece of the rope that hanged Howard, and it was prominently displayed in the jail cabinet for many years, along with the bullet that killed Martino. You might be wondering about Howard's last words, "The hide goes with the tallow." It referenced the skin of cattle or sheep and the animal's rendered solid fat, which were both very big economic commodities in California at the time. Why he chose to say that, who knows? He had a fondness for slang, it seems. Even the press at the time found it a rather odd thing to say. One even called it vulgar. As far as I could tell, Marshal Carlisle never issued a statement regarding John Howard. George Washington Roberts, the next execution, arrived at Folsom 3 weeks before Howard was hanged, and he wouldn't be there very long. George Washington Roberts, Folsom's 6th execution, September 4th, 1896. Records going back to 1880 show George Roberts lived in a Sacramento halfway house in his late 20s to early 30s. Reports in 1896 reference an 1875 murder of a man named W.H. Shaw by David Turley, who was at the time, like Roberts, a sheep herder, and that Roberts was somehow involved in the fight that resulted in Shaw's death. Turley hanged in the Sacramento County Jail in February of 1876. This was before the condemned were sent to state prisons for execution. It's possible Roberts' stint in the halfway house stemmed from this murder. In April of 1892, Roberts surfaced again, having beat a Chinese ferryman with a rock when he demanded Roberts pay the toll to cross the Sacramento River. The next month, on April 27th, he pleaded not guilty. And 2 days later, Li Gong, the cigar owner from episode 2, was killed. In all likelihood, he and Chin Hain, Gong's alleged killer in Folsom's first execution, were both incarcerated in the Sacramento jail during this time. At the end of June, for unknown reasons, District Attorney Frank Ryan, who was also prosecuting Hain and later Ivan Kovalev, asked the court to be lenient on Roberts. This, despite his previous criminal record and that the victim, the ferryman, wasn't expected to survive. I couldn't locate any further records on the matter, except that Roberts was released after only 2 months. A year later, 1893, charges of criminal assault on a woman were filed against Roberts in El Dorado County, but the case was dismissed for insufficient evidence. Then yet another reference to his involvement in a, quote, cutting scrape at a place on Placerville Road in El Dorado County, the outcome of which is unknown. Then on April 14th, 1896, the day John Craig was being dropped off at Folsom, Robert's volatile temper was flaring up over in Latrobe, Paulo Kamaunu's stomping grounds. In a bar referenced as Jim Harris's Saloon, 44-year-old Roberts had been drinking with several people, including 24-year-old Walter D. Freeman, a wrestling champion and son of local hotel owners. Not just any hotel, though. You see, Freeman was the nephew of former Senator of Oakland, James Harrison Miller, who had been a state assemblyman in the 1870s. But what he was really known for was building Miller's Hotel in 1863. Freeman's uncle had given the Placerville and Sacramento Valley Railroads the right-of-way on his property, which established the town of Latrobe. Miller had opened a grocery store, saloon, and had a sheep farming business with 10,000 acres that stretched close to Lake Tahoe. In the 1880s, he gave the hotel to his sister, Nancy Freeman, and she and her husband, Walter's parents, ran it until 1902. Walter Freeman was a well-liked and popular guy who, aside from wrestling, excelled in several sports, and evidently, Roberts challenged him to a wrestling match, which Freeman declined, saying, "You are too old a man for me." Roberts insisted, and as expected, Freeman easily pinned his opponent. Roberts left with a bruised ego and returned with a grudge and a pistol, but bystanders, including a man named George Penter, disarmed Roberts immediately. "There is no occasion to feel hard toward Freeman," Penter told Roberts. "He threw you fairly, and that is all there is to it." He urged Roberts to forget about it and take a drink. Roberts sat next to Freeman, shook his hand, and engaged him and his friends in conversation. The smile on Roberts' face betrayed signs of his true intent. As he chatted in a friendly manner, Roberts nonchalantly pulled a large jackknife from his pocket and plunged it into Freeman's neck, severing the jugular vein. Men jumped to their feet and restrained Roberts, while a Dr. Powers, already in the saloon, tended to Freeman, who was still sitting upright in his chair. He asked the doctor, "Am I hurt much?" "My good man," Powers replied, "you are already dead." Freeman sank from his chair and died. Meanwhile, Roberts was locked in another room until the authorities arrived. Sheriff Charles Hilbert and District Attorney Prentice Carpenter, the same men who investigated and arrested Kamaunu 2 years earlier, took charge of Roberts. As expected, the subsequent coroner's inquest ended with a guilty verdict. I also saw one report that Roberts worked as a sheep herder for James H. Miller, Freeman's uncle. Trial began on May 26th. The same day, Governor James Budd declined to interfere in Kamaunu's execution. Roberts claimed he was intoxicated and that he couldn't remember anything that happened. Witnesses said he wasn't that drunk and he knew what he was doing. On June 2nd, the jury found Roberts guilty of first-degree murder. After being sentenced to hang on September 4th, Roberts, accompanied by Sheriff Hilbert, arrived at Folsom on June 23rd in reportedly a jovial mood. He didn't file an appeal, something he later expressed regret over. After John Howard's execution less than a month later, only he and the train wrecker, Salter D. Worden, remained on death row. Roberts kept up his bravado and enjoyed talking about his crime. He told guards, "It was only a barroom quarrel, and those things are apt to happen at any time, but I suppose I'll swing for it." He opted to be baptized by the prison chaplain, but according to the San Francisco Chronicle, he, quote, experienced no change of feeling and spoke jokingly of the murder the moment the priest left. He even said he planned to dance a jig on the scaffold. That morning, guards offered him a glass of whiskey. "None of that stuff for me," he said, pushing it away. "That's the stuff that brought me to this, and I don't propose I have it said that I went to my death full of it." 3 women, one said to be Freeman's wife, although there's no record of him being married, and 2 of his sisters, accompanied by 5 little children, also said to be his, but pretty sure were not, waited outside the prison after being refused entry. A paper wrote, "They claim the privilege of witnessing the execution as a right," but Warden All was firm in his refusal. When it came time for Roberts, the Ohio native, to jump and jive his way into death, he instead appeared solemn, searching the crowd until he found Freeman's brothers and father, and nodded to them. His neck didn't break in the fall, and while papers reported that he didn't struggle, Roberts certainly slowly strangled to death. Salter D. Worden continued to languish on death row, this time alone, until March 2nd, 1897, when Benito Lopez arrived. Benito Lopez, Folsom's 7th execution, May 21st, 1897. As the saying goes, fences make good neighbors, but even a small stone wall couldn't prevent Benito Lopez and George S. Washburn, both 69 years old and longtime residents of San Andreas, from regularly arguing. Washburn, described as a straightforward and well-liked man, had been dealing with an unspecified sickness for some time that reportedly made him nervous, irritable, and short-fused, yet he was considered harmless. Lopez, on the other hand, had a very quarrelsome reputation. In fact, he had been on probation for a year after he knifed a man during a fight, and he had been long suspected of killing a man many years earlier. I wasn't able to ever verify that, though. "Lopez is a hard character," read one newspaper, "always in trouble of some kind." They also said, although he is a Central American, he was living here when the first white man came to the country in the early days, following mining, and later becoming a wood chopper. Around 4 p.m. on April 4th, 1896, on the outskirts of town, Washburn began digging a trench in his yard near the property line to divert water from the well on Lopez's property that frequently overflowed onto his. Washburn's wife, Mary, watched from the house, perhaps knowing something might happen. And sure enough, Lopez emerged from his small cabin and angrily told Washburn he was doing it all wrong. But Washburn said he wanted nothing to do with Lopez and continued his work using a hoe. He then called Lopez a thief and a heated exchange ensued. Hearing the yelling, other neighbors came to watch the feuding men. At one point, Washburn raised the hoe and swung it toward Lopez, but the two were several yards apart. There was no danger of Lopez being injured. Lopez turned and retreated into his home, leaving everyone to think that maybe the situation had ended. But he came back out, this time carrying a revolver. When Washburn saw this, he wisely turned to go back into the house. He knew Lopez was never one to back down from a fight. "Oh, you go away now," Lopez said. "Yes, I want nothing to do with you," replied Washburn. Lopez wanted to be the one to end the argument. He fired, and the bullet struck Washburn's left shoulder blade. He staggered, and Lopez fired again. This time, the bullet hit him in the back of the neck, sending Washburn to the ground. Neighbors ran to the victim and carried him into his house, while another ran to summon a doctor. But nothing could be done to save him. Lopez went back inside his house and placed the gun under his mattress. He then stepped outside, locked the door behind him, and set out for the sheriff's office. He came upon Constable Masterson, who was already on his way to arrest Lopez, and he asked him what he was doing. "Oh, I shot old Washburn." "Did you hurt him?" "Well, I guess so. I meant to. I shot to kill." Masterson asked him what type of gun he used. "With a pistol, a big one. I meant business." Well, at least Lopez was honest. The San Francisco Examiner correspondent who visited Lopez in the county jail the following day described him as a small man of treacherous and dangerous appearance, who wasn't taking the matter with the least bit of concern. On April 14th, the same day Roberts killed Freeman and John Craig entered Folsom, Lopez faced Justice of the Peace P.H. Keene, who held him over for trial. Interestingly, the case was not reported on again until February 23rd, the following year, when a Stockton newspaper interviewed George B. Washburn, the victim's son, who had just returned from San Andreas after Lopez's second trial. None of these court records could be located. Sitting in Stockton's Hoffman Cafe with a reporter from the Stockton Evening and Sunday Record, Washburn told of how no journalists covered Lopez's first trial. That ended in a hung jury in December of 1896, nor the retrial in mid-February. The reporter wrote, "The gentleman was busy as a corresponding secretary, writing letters to friends telling of the law avenging his father's murder, which he has had to supply because of the absence of telegraphic reports. What we know is that the first jury ended with 11 votes for death and 1 for life. But the second trial, where Lopez represented himself, ended in a death sentence to be carried out May 21st, 1897. On April 28th, Leso Lopez, a daughter of Benito's, wrote to Governor James Budd explaining that they lacked the funds to file an appeal and asked if he would issue a reprieve so that she and her sister Louise could somehow file an appeal. "I thought I would write to you myself and find out what I have to do," she wrote, "and if there is any step that I can take towards saving my father's life, please let me know, as I would be very thankful to hear of it, as I never forget a favor, you know. That a poor man, if he commits a crime, he is looked upon as nothing and gets a terrible sentence. Now he gets the worst of it. I have known cases worse than that, and they receive a light sentence, but if there is any show for my poor father, let me know at the earliest." She went on to say that his court-appointed attorneys were beginners who didn't know anything about the case, and she wrote, "I think it was a job put up all around because they asked me to give them $2,000 to appeal the case, for they knew that they had got everything we had, and they knew that I did not have that amount." It certainly was a lot of money then. She said the attorneys had also failed to inform her how much time a notice of appeal had to be filed after a conviction. Her sister Louise also sent a letter to Governor Budd on May 4th, explaining that her father was, quote, a very old man and has had paralysis, been out of his head at times, and been an inmate of the county hospital for the paralysis. She said her parents separated when she was 3 and, quote, I have only seen my father a few times, and I judge he must have been provoked and aggravated to commit murder. At this late day, I beg and appeal to you to save my father's life from the rope. He is 70 years of age and only a short time for this world. But Governor Budd refused to intervene. On May 21st, Lopez, the oldest of the 93 men, mounted the gallows, reportedly hopeful to the end that Governor Budd would save him. But as Warden All read the death warrant, interpreted in Spanish by Sheriff Thorne, the realization undoubtedly set in. On Lopez's behalf, Father Santandreu of a Spanish church in San Francisco addressed the crowd, saying Lopez was thankful to the prison for their kindness, that he forgave all his enemies, and that he asked pardon for his sins. His last words were to complain about the tightening of the rope around his neck. Now, only Salter Warden and John Barthelman, Folsom's 10th execution, who had arrived at Folsom in early February, remained on the penitentiary's death row, at least for 6 more days, when James Berry arrived a mere 8 days after committing a brutal murder. Our final story of today's episode is that of James Berry, Folsom's 8th execution, August 13th, 1897. A few months earlier, on May 18th in Modesto, J.F. Tucker noticed how concerned and frightened his black housekeeper, 36-year-old Alice Berry, seemed and asked her to confide in him. She tearfully explained that her husband, jealous and cruel, had been particularly abusive toward her in the previous days, even whipping her for touching the arm of a male friend she had been talking to. Although James Berry never felt he needed a reason to beat his wife, he believed their mere union entitled him to treat her any way he wanted. Alice told Tucker that she knew James would kill her someday, but she feared asking for police protection. Tucker urged her to, and so when 38-year-old James Berry showed up at the Tucker home, he, quote, went sullenly away, muttering to himself, after Sheriff Purvis ordered him to go home. That evening, a deputy escorted Alice to the home of her friends, Nick and Belle Campbell, and she told them that despite her fear, she would go downtown in the morning to swear out a complaint against her husband. Unfortunately, James Berry got to her first. At around 6 a.m., Berry went to Tucker's home looking for Alice, and when he didn't find her there, he guessed correctly that she had gone to the Campbell home. Berry waited until Nick left before pounding on the door. Receiving no answer, he went all around the house trying to enter through windows, but failed to find any entry into the home. Alice, meanwhile, escaped out of a window and ran to a neighbor's house, the O'Learys. Unfortunately, Berry caught sight of her and ran after her. She managed to get inside before Berry arrived, and Mrs. O'Leary told Berry she'd shoot him if he didn't leave. Shoot away, he told her, and pushed his way inside the home. Alice, only partially dressed, escaped and ran to a barn, but when she saw that he spotted her, she darted back to the Campbell home. Berry had a gun and shot at Alice, but missed. As he caught up to her at the house, she begged him not to shoot her, but he kicked her, ordering her to get dressed. He shoved and kicked her into a bedroom. Belle, meanwhile, ran out of the house, and as she did, she heard a single shot. Berry walked out the front door and told Belle, "She's there. I killed her." He fired another shot into the ground, then proceeded to walk downtown, where he delightedly told everyone he encountered what he had just done. One of these people was Deputy R.D. Young, who arrested him. Alice Berry was found in a heap on the bedroom floor, dead from a bullet that went through her heart and out her back. Under the headline, Cold-Blooded Crime of a Worthless Colored Ruffian, the San Francisco Call described how Berry never worked, forcing his wife to labor hard for support of both. In the jail, Berry swaggered up to the reporter, quote, with his hat on one side of his bullet head, and said, "All that I have to say is that me and my wife had a falling out Sunday night, and she called me a liar and I slapped her. She refused to come home with me. That's all I got to say. Her and me had a falling out, and I shot her." This nonchalant, even prideful demeanor would mark Berry's behavior from here on out, and guards didn't even take precautions to prevent citizen vengeance when rumors of lynching circulated. To account for his calm demeanor, the Modesto Bee explained, "We have been reliably informed that there is Indian blood in the veins of the murderer, which undoubtedly explains his stoical behavior so characteristic of that race." The paper said that Berry had traveled all across North America and that he was known as Texas Tom, a dangerous outlaw. This might have been true, however, I couldn't verify that. The paper also said he is very unpopular with the colored people of the city, and they are more pleased to have him removed from their midst than are the white people. At his arraignment, Berry ignored his court-appointed attorneys and jumped to his feet, insisting to plead guilty, the first of the 12 men of the 93 to do so. "As I said in the first place, my wife did me wrong, and I killed her," he said. "I told her I would kill her wherever I found her at, and I am ready now, I believe, to take the judge's decision. If it was to do over, I would blow her up if God Almighty would strengthen me with the power enough to pull the trigger if I had one in my hands." He rambled on, saying that he was feeble and that his days were short. Begging for death, he told the court, "I don't regret the killing of her. All I ask is that you not worry my life out in the penitentiary, but I would truly say I would be the happiest man in the state of California if you would sign the warrant for my execution tomorrow and take me and lay me by her side out there, and that is all I ask of the court. God be with you all until we meet again. And judge, for God's sakes, don't banish me to days in the penitentiary. Put me to execution. I know I deserve it." The Merced Sun newspaper wrote the, quote, "colored monster of Modesto ought to be humored in this manner and sent on his way without any unnecessary delay." Berry was clearly proud of what he had done and said, "The secret why I killed her, that will go to the grave between me and my God. It would do no good to state it to the public and wouldn't help the affair a bit." He told the city undertaker that if his body was returned to Modesto, to dress him in a shirt and tie that his wife had made for him. Judge Minor sentenced Berry to die Friday, August 13th, 1897. Elated, Berry told the courtroom spectators, "Goodbye, ladies and gentlemen. Be good to yourselves, and you ladies who are married, be true to your husbands. Don't forget this." Berry had always accused Alice of wronging him, which her friends insisted came, unsurprisingly, without foundation. Mrs. Berry was an honest, industrious colored woman who had the respect of her neighbors, both white and black, wrote the Sacramento Bee. On death row, Berry joined fellow wife murderer John Barthelman, Folsom's 10th execution, and our train wrecker, Salter D. Warden. Reportedly, Berry and Warden, who used to exercise in the yard together, had a falling out, and guards had to keep Berry away from him after Berry repeatedly threatened to kill Warden. Not long after Berry entered Folsom, Deputy Young received a letter from Chief of Police F.B. Hinman from Galesburg, Illinois, where the Berrys lived before moving to Modesto 3 years prior. Hinman thanked Young for sending information he had requested about Berry, saying his patrol driver, John W. Britton's wife, was a sister of Alice's, and they were grateful to know the particulars of the case. Barry was a mean, ugly rascal when he lived here, and his wife had trouble with him then, the chief wrote. He broke her arm for her while in the city. We are glad he is getting what he so justly deserves. On the night before his execution, prison authorities said that Barry was cheerful, wouldn't accept any religious consolation, and remained unremorseful. The San Francisco Call wrote, "This morning the corridors of the great stone building re-echoed with his merry laugh, and he cracked jokes with the men keeping the death watch." And quote, "When Warden All entered his cell to read the death warrant, Barry laughed and declined to hear it." Barry did read a telegram he received from his mother in Paris, Missouri, where she expressed her grief and sympathy. She told her son she was powerless to save him and that she wished for him to die like a brave man. Barry requested that All reply to her with, "Everything is elegant, and I will meet you on the other shore." Dressed in the requested shirt and tie that Alice had made for him, brought to the prison by the undertaker, Barry stood on the gallows smiling as the black cap was placed over his head. A small group of Modesto citizens, for some reason, paid to have his body shipped back to the city. He was, however, buried without ceremony in a pauper's field. For days after the execution, people continued to discuss Barry's shockingly stoic and cheerful manner, calling his, quote, "gameness" as phenomenal. The Sacramento Union begged to differ, writing, "No man could murder his wife unless he possessed an iron-bound nerve utterly devoid of the slightest instincts of a human being." Of all of the 93 men executed at Folsom, Barry's journey to the gallows, from the crime to his death, was the shortest, just 2 months and 25 days. Thank you for joining me for this episode. Next time, you'll hear the stories of Folsom's 9th and 12th executions, the first case of all of these stories to have more than one person held accountable for a murder. Complicity. C.H. Raymond would hang next, but his co-defendant, Harry Winters, would hang later, as his involvement was less straightforward than Raymond's, and a divided state Supreme Court showed that there was more than reasonable doubt, but serious doubt that existed concerning Winters' alleged guilt. And I agree. So I hope you'll join me in a month for that story. Falling Through the Trap is written and produced by me, April Moore. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also leave a review, and follow the show on Instagram at Falling Through the Trap. I'll post photos and other documents on my Substack page, apriljmoore.substack.com, where you'll also be able to listen to each episode. Find the show on YouTube as well. Check the show notes for links, including one for Patreon, where I share lots of extras. Join me every third Friday of the month, where you'll learn the story of the next man to fall through the trap at Folsom Prison.